training tonight, it's a shorter training, but what I was trying to do was capture sort of navigating BPS, whether you're 3 years old coming into the system or whether you're approaching 22, and sort of what the differences are. A lot of times, regardless of the age of your child, the laws and the procedures that go along with sort of the IEP and evaluation process, they're all the same. It just depends on, you know, where you are in the system and what you need to pay attention to depending on the age of your child. I mean, obviously the transition years are something that's important, and I'm not just talking about when your child turns 14 and becomes eligible for transition planning, but also with regard to sort of when your child's going into, you know, leaving elementary, whether or not you're in a K to 8, but then if they're going into middle school, and then if they're going into high school as well, and sort of what you want to be looking at each one of those. So this is sort of just yet another handout that we did, and again, please appreciate the fact that if you've already heard some of this information, I apologize for the redundancy, but we have a different number of people attend every month. We have, you know, different number of people watching the video, so a lot of this is just an effort to reiterate that, to get it out, and to answer questions that parents may have on it. So with regard to sort of this itself, we're just going to run through sort of the general process, and I'll try to highlight things as I go. And, you know, I'll take questions at the end. And if you have specific questions about your own child's IEP or process, I'm happy to answer those questions. But if you could hold those to the end so that people that need to get going can go, and we can just talk separately about that. Yes? We need to do that. We'll put them up on the website in Spanish. Okay. But you know.
I'll make it an active page so it's translated on the fly.
Yeah, John has, thank God for John, because John is the one that created the whole website and puts all these materials up on it. I'm lucky I can answer my own email, but he's also has the Google Translator on there. So, you know, we don't have an interpreter assigned to us as SpedPac, but, you know, we utilize those services. But in creating all these documents, obviously we want to give people the ability to translate those. So I apologize if it's not perfect translation, but it does provide it, you know, obviously in some medium, and obviously we'll try to improve that as we go and go forward. But it's not only limited to Spanish; it will also translate it into other languages as well. So I think it's pretty cool. But okay, so ages 3 to 22. It doesn't really matter what age your child is. That does not determine whether or not they would be eligible for special education services. What you know is that it's as early as age 3, and it can be up to age 22. You should know if your child accepts a diploma and graduates from BPS, they are no longer eligible for special education services. Children can remain eligible for services up until age 22. So you need to sort of look at that when your child's getting older, whether or not it's whether or not they should be accepting a diploma, or whether or not they can be accepting a diploma, or whether or not they need to continue services. I think that's important for the older kids, because what you have to realize is that when you do turn 22, there's no longer any rights to services. It's more of a benefit. So it's really a matter of whatever the state has for services for adults, you get in line, and it's more of, by law, it has to be like sort of first in time, because there was a lawsuit in the past where people were jumping over the line, and, you know, so now it's mandated that it's first come, first serve, and then when the services are gone, they're gone. And unfortunately, because of the current economy, the issue of adult services is something that's suffered a lot of cuts recently. So I try to bring that to people's attention, because I think that your child, if your child needs services up until the age of 22, you need to realize that that's available to them. And, you know, it's not limited to just academics. It could be relating to things like social skills and job opportunities and job coaching, and, you know, all those things can be part of their transition planning, and that can continue, you know, through past 18 and into their early 20s. So, and how we determine eligibility? It's through the evaluations. I talked about this before. Your child would be evaluated when they initially, they determine whether or not your child has a disability, and then because of that disability, they require special education services or one or more of the related services, which are the therapies. And then after your child is initially determined eligible. Every 3 years, your child will be reevaluated. And if your child is in early intervention, you want to start that process when they're 2.5 years old, because the system is set up that you want that process to start when they're 2.5, because that gives you a 6-month window to get the evaluations done, to convene the team, to develop the IEP, and then if there's any issues with it or any disputes, you have some additional time built into that process. So that, because services start the day the child turns 3. The day the child turns 3, early intervention leaves your life, and you need to be ready to enter the educational world. That's just the way the law is. So a referral can be made by anybody, a parent. It can be made by a caregiver or a professional that works with your child. So that would be, you know, a doctor, a pediatrician, any specialist that maybe you're getting your child's speech therapy, and the parent would do it. And a referral, once you do a referral within 5 school days, the district's supposed to say, we got your notice of a referral, and here is the consent form with a list of the evaluations that we're proposing to do for your child. You're not constrained to just whatever the district listed. The district needs to evaluate your child in all areas of suspected disability. So if there's an area that you think that your child is behind on and needs to be evaluated, and it's not on that list, then you can ask for an evaluation in that area. Like an ABA evaluation, if that's not on the consent form, that may be something that you want to add in. You know, maybe they didn't include a speech therapist, whatever it is, but I just want you to know that the consent form, you have the opportunity to ask for additional evaluations than the ones that they proposed. And then the issue of when you sign that consent form triggers the timelines for the completion of those evaluations, and then the eventual team meeting to determine eligibility and to develop an IEP. On the next slide, it says required assessments, and I put that there just so that you know that it's not simply educational assessments. It's not limited to academics, that it's assessments in those additional areas, including communication and memory and social relationships with groups, because those are all areas of a child's development that are going to impact them in terms of their ability to access future education opportunities, future employment, and independent living. That's the goal of special education.
Is there a specific type of assessment if you're looking for your child to be assessed on behavior and social skills? Like, what would that be labeled?
Those are actually 2 different things. So behavior, it would depend on what the behavior is that you're concerned about. But generally speaking, you would ask for a functional behavior assessment. It's called an FBA. And a functional behavior assessment is really something that looks at the child's behavior and sort of what is the purpose of that behavior, and does that behavior need to be changed or modified in some way to either make it stop interfering with the child's ability to access learning, or to make it more socially appropriate. So functional behavior assessment is really sort of looking at the behavior. They might sort of look at, it's called like the antecedent, what is happening before the behavior occurs, what is the target behavior, and then what's the consequence in terms of what are people doing in response to that behavior. Because if it's an attention-seeking behavior and the response that you're giving your child is attention, then you're actually going to cause them to repeat that behavior, and for that behavior, you know, harder to be changed because you're reinforcing it. So.
What does the psychological assessment look at? That has nothing to do with behavior?
Generally, no. A psychological assessment, you know, a neuropsychologist will look at all developmental areas of the child. They probably wouldn't look at like occupational therapy or speech specifically, but they would look at the child's understanding and use of language, but not in terms of like articulation issues and stuff like that. The psychologist will generally, they can do psychological testing, which is sort of IQ testing, if you will. It looks at whether or not your child's, like, what their verbal skills are, what their perceptual reasoning skills are, their working memory, and their processing speed. And then they may also do academic testing. But they can expand that to do testing that relates to executive function issues, visual spatial processing, but they generally don't look at behavior you know, in terms of doing a specific evaluation, a testing tool in that area. But if your child has deficits in the area of behavior or issues in the area of behavior that, you know, it's not developmentally appropriate given their age and, you know, what it is they're expected to do on a day-to-day, or even their social skills, those are areas that you want to ask the district to specifically address.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it after, because they told me that's the assessment they're doing, and now I have to prove that he's eligible because he's so high functioning.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, but I mean, it's good to know what the different assessments are. I think that moving forward, one of the trainings that I'll want to add is sort of interpreting testing results, because it's very different in terms of testing scores that you have done when the child's being evaluated for a disability. You know, you need to be able to read those scores so that, you know, it's one of those things that growing up, if I got an 85 as my score in school, then I would say, oh, that's pretty good, that's a B+. But that's actually not a B+ when it comes to these types of evaluations. That's actually one entire standard deviation below the mean. And then a 70, which you would say is like a C-, that's actually in the borderline area of functioning. So I think that'll be something that we address on the go forward. It's just an issue of getting everything in, and next month is the election. So, but in any event, so you want to look at what's being offered as the test. Make sure that they're looking at all the areas that you have a concern about, put them on the consent form, and then from the time that you sign that consent form and give it to the district, that they have 30 school days to complete those evaluations. And then if your child's being initially evaluated, or even their 3-year, it's 45 school working days from the time you sign that consent form to the time they're supposed to have the team meeting, and then you look at eligibility and develop the IEP. The next slide is specifically about children with autism spectrum disorder, and I put this slide in here because we have very different and better laws in Massachusetts regarding children on the autism spectrum than exist in other places. And you know, I put the section of the law directly in here because what it really does is identify for parents. You know, within the middle of it, it says, and it talks about if your child is on the autistic disorder, meaning whether they have Asperger's, whether they have PDD, whether they have, you know, Rett syndrome, which is on it. So, and then it says the IEP shall consider and shall specifically address the following. So it requires the IEP team to then look at all these areas: verbal and nonverbal communication, social skills interactions, you know, sensory issues. So my daughter is not on the spectrum. So her team is not required to look at all of these different areas. Now, she may have those needs in and of herself because of who she is as an individual, but by law, they're not mandated to look at those areas like they are for children on the spectrum. So I think it's really important that parents know about what the law says on this. And one of the things is that the Department of Education did a specific memo on not only this law, but describing to teams how it is that they should go addressing this. And one of it talks about looking at behaviors. I mean, you can be very smart academically, but if your behavior is interfering, then that's impacting your performance. So one thing is they're not mutually exclusive. So that's one of the other memos that we're going to put on the website too, so that people can include it in their favorites. But I think it's important, if you go through and your child's on the spectrum and you look at all these specific areas that need to be addressed, you'll see that it's a very comprehensive and substantive piece of legislation in terms of really outlining all the areas they want them to look at for children on the spectrum. So I think it's great that Massachusetts has it. And the follow-on with that was now the ERISA law that opens up the opportunity to get services for children on the spectrum, not just through the IEP process, but through their private insurance. Because you have to understand, private insurance companies are very behind the times in terms of identifying what the needs are, and children with disabilities they're not included in the consideration of the development of these plans the way that they need to be. And obviously the prevalence of disabilities and children with disabilities in our society has gone up significantly, especially for those on the spectrum, because I know that when my daughter's nonverbal and she uses a device to communicate, and I remember that when I was first trying to access insurance to get her a device to be able to communicate, I said, well, you know, why isn't that covered by the insurance? And they said, well, we don't have a code for that. And I said, okay, well, how's O1? You know, I was like, just make one up. And it was really that they just had not encountered it before, that, you know, that they didn't come across it. But what they said was, okay, well, I said, you know, I said, I think that's discriminatory. You don't have a code for something. But what it really comes back to is sort of what your own, whoever your employer is, what did they negotiate and what did they ask to be included in the policy? And a lot of it just, you know, it wasn't happening at a high enough incidence that they felt it was important for their employees to include that benefit, and now it's actually catching up to it. So, and if your insurance company doesn't currently cover something and your child needs it, then tell them that you want to appeal it or you want them to make an exception, because I'll tell you, I think Blue Cross has been really responsive in that regard. And you know, the issue that I had, and that was many years ago, they said, well, you're right, we don't have a code for that, but we'll make an exception and we'll cover it, you know. So, you never know, so ask. It doesn't hurt to ask. So completed evaluations, what I wanted people to know about that is that when your child is evaluated, you have a right to that information in advance of the team meeting. But you won't get that information in advance of the team meeting if you don't ask for it and if you don't ask for it in writing. So what I tell people to do to sort of deal with both issues at the same time is when you fill out your consent form and you're writing your signature, you write right on the consent form, please provide copies of all reports at least 2 days in advance of the meeting. That way you don't have to worry, you know, through the next 30 school days, you know, sort of what the process is or whether or not you asked for it, and, you know, it saves paper as well. So I think it's easier to do, and you certainly don't want to be walking into a meeting and being handed a bunch of evaluations, because as I said, the testing is different, the scoring is different. It's going to require a lot of, you know, I like to go over the reports and sort of read them and, you know, say, well, this is, you want to identify what you understand and what you agree with, and then what you don't understand and what you don't agree with, so that you can bring those up at the team meeting itself. So preparing for the team meeting, I just talked about things that I thought would be helpful for you to do in advance, and one of those things is to write your parent concerns out and to, you know, use those recent evaluations if there are any in terms of writing your concerns, because those evaluations should talk about what the areas of weakness are, and you want the team to be focused on those and developing the IEP. And then if you don't have recent evaluations, then look at your child's IEP and their progress reports. Did they meet their benchmarks? Did they meet their goals? And if they did, that's great. It just means what is the next step to move on from. And if they didn't make them, then the question is why? Was it too lofty of a goal? Do we need to revise it? Or do we need to revise the services a little bit because the services were not as effective as we expected them to be?
How long is an outside evaluation valid for? Does that make sense?
Yes. It's not that it would be invalid, but what you would say is that the information in it would become stale, meaning old, right? So generally the issue is that from the time the district does their evaluations, you can disagree with their evaluations and you can request an independent evaluation from the district for up to 16 months. Now the reason that they say the 16 months is because after 16 months period of time, the district could reevaluate themselves. You know what I mean, in terms of they could do additional testing, because then their testing is old. So what I would say to you is that it's not invalid. It would always be valid testing if it was done in accordance with the testing protocols, but whether or not it was still current information, current enough to be helpful to the team to inform it about what the child's needs were on it. But if it was less than a year or two old, then, you know, that's okay. So with regard to sort of the team meeting process and preparing for it, let them know who you're bringing, if anybody. You know, people don't like to be surprised, so it's just a courtesy thing. I always tell people to bring somebody that can take notes. It's hard to listen and take notes at the same time, and you want to have a good record of what happened at your team meeting. And these are sort of like, you know, things to think of in advance. You can't really ask somebody to drop everything and come to your team meeting the next day, so it's one of those things that find out who can come, ask them, you know, to be available on that date, and then let the team chairperson know that you're going to be bringing someone. So, and then also you need to know that the team meeting that you have, it needs to be on a date and time that's convenient for you. you know, it needs to be mutually agreeable. It's not dictated by the district. It's a team process, and we all have lives too. And you know, whether one or both parents needs to come, or if you wanted to have one of your experts come or participate by phone, you can do that. But you know, it's a lot of coordination of different schedules. So just know that it's not something that the district was telling you it was on a date and time, and that was something that you couldn't do. That you don't have a right to reschedule that. You just need to know that it needs to be worked out together. So.
Carolyn, can I ask a question, or can I back you up? I think something was asked before about independent evaluations.
Yep.
What's the standard procedure if there is such a thing for requesting an independent evaluation? And I believe there's also provisions in law for the school district to help pay for them in some cases.
Yep.
But they don't necessarily want to. Or whatever, they may.
Well, let me explain that. So, anytime the district does an evaluation, you can disagree with that evaluation, and you can request an independent evaluation in that area, okay?
So that's just a letter you write, essentially.
You could just say it at the team meeting, too. You know, I disagree with the results of this evaluation, and I'm requesting an independent evaluation. What you need to understand is that there's two laws that apply to that. One is the federal law, and one is the state law. So under the federal law, if the district does not respond, and this does need, your request does need to be in writing, because you'll need to show you made the request. They don't take you to a hearing within 5 days. They have to pay for it, okay? That's the law, under the federal law. They have to, hold on though, they have to pay for it, but what they pay is also dictated by law. So basically, under federal law, it's saying if you want to fight and show that your evaluation was comprehensive and appropriate and something I should have agreed with but didn't, then you have the right to take me to a hearing and say there's nothing wrong with your evaluation. You don't have to pay for another one. The state law basically says you can ask for one, and then how much is paid by the district versus how much is paid by the family is based on a sliding scale based on people's incomes. But there's also a section of the law, so that's determined by income, and they would tell you, you know, sort of how to split that. But what you need to know is that by law, the district is only required to pay the state rate for that evaluation. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because a lot of providers don't accept the state rate for the evaluation cost. So that's where you want to get into sort of finding what I say is, can you provide us with a list of approved providers that take the state rate? Instead of you're going out and trying to find somebody.
And that hearing within 5 days, that's with DESE, that's with the state?
Yes, that's with the Bureau of Special Education Appeals.
A question, the lady wants to know if a child with IEP has to repeat a grade. How do you feel about that?
I think it depends on the individual child. I mean, sometimes it can be appropriate and sometimes it's not. It would really depend on how is the child accessing the curriculum? Is the child making progress in the curriculum so that they're now able to move forward in the grade and access it? You know, it doesn't mean that curriculum can't be modified at every grade level. I'm not trying to say that, but developmentally. Some people, you know, it's usually a decision on retaining that's between the parent and the principal. It's not decided by the IEP team. And what you want to figure out is, how do you feel about it? And, you know, that's sort of the discussion that parents have. So it's not really a disability-dependent issue. You know, it obviously can be related to that in some way, but it's not, there's not one rule one way or the other. It depends on the child.
Definitivo. As a mother, I'm not in agreement with the child that a child should repeat.
Okay, then you don't have to agree with that.
Pero quería saber la opinión de ellos como profesional de estos niños deben repetir con un IP o a extenderle las ayudas para que el niño progrese más. Para que el niño progrese más.
Yes.
Que yo quería saber la opinión de ellos como profesionales para si el niño está progresando, deben de extenderle más ayuda del niño repetir.
Yeah, she would just like to know your opinion as a professional. whether you think that a child with EAP can progress with more help.
I think that's a complicated issue. I'm happy to talk to her afterwards.
In other words, instead of repeating the grade, if the child could just get more help.
That's definitely something that she needs to decide about, because there's two different things. Are they suggesting that the child needs to be retained because the child's not making progress, but would the progress be impacted by more supports and services? I'm happy to talk to her about that directly. I will say as a parent, I have had my child retained, but I'm sure that other people don't agree with that. So I would never tell somebody what that decision would be. It's a family decision, and it's something to talk to your principal about.
Ella ha tenido una hija retenida, pero ella está puede hablar con ella personalmente.
Okay. All right, so the next slide, it has to do with the team process itself. And it really talks about, you know, whether or not the child's eligible, and it talks about what needs to be occurring there. And then if the team finds the student eligible, then it needs to move forward and develop an IEP. I underlined this section of the regulation because it's really saying that regardless of the type of disability, the disability itself is not what defines the supports and services that the child needs. So if people are told that information, you can have two children with a completely different disability that have the same needs, and then you can have two children with the same exact disability that have completely different needs. So the name of the disability does not drive the services. It's how the disability impacts your individual child that identifies what services your child needs. The next section is talking about developing the IEP. So what I did was I just broke down all the sections of the IEP for you, so that when you go into the IEP meeting, you know the areas that you're going to be covering, and you have those in advance so that you can sort of do it as a little checklist as you go through your meeting. The next slide has to do with the least restrictive environment, and what that means is that by law, children that have disabilities are supposed to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So that means it says that they're only to be removed from the general education classroom if the nature and severity of their disability makes educating them in the regular education classroom inappropriate. You know, it says if it cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So it's really that all children are supposed to be in inclusion unless the team decides otherwise. Now, inclusion has been a big priority for SpedPac because it's important for parents of children with special needs that they be with their typical peers. There was just a study that came out from Harvard University by Tom Hare, who was involved a lot with the Henderson Inclusion School. And what it shows is that children that have disabilities that are educated with their typical peers do much better on MCAS testing and on other tests. So obviously exposure to the peers and working alongside their peers is shown to have a positive outcome, but I think it's important that parents know that it's the law that children with disabilities be educated with their typical peers. We know that the inclusion programs in Boston have been limited in the past. We have a high number of students, over 45%, close to 49%, that are educated in substantially separate settings, and we're working to change that and to bring on more inclusive programs and more inclusive classrooms. So we went from having basically the Henderson, the Mary Lyon, the Mason, for the earlier grades anyway. I think I'm not as familiar with the Mason, and then the Harbor Middle School as being inclusive schools. There were 10 additional programs added last September, and there's more being added for this September. But they're not fully inclusive in terms of the Henderson and the Mary Lyon, that every grade across the school is inclusive. But what it does say is that there's more opportunities for more children to be educated with their typical peers in their neighborhood schools by expanding the number of schools that provide those opportunities. So, I mean, the least restrictive environment, it's sort of a long phrase that just means that you should go to the same school you would go to if you weren't disabled when you are disabled. Yep.
Carolyn, two questions about that. It seems to me that, I mean, John has talked to this about inclusion schools in the project, and I've asked him a lot of questions about it, because my child is supposed to be in an inclusion setting. She went through a placement process already this year, and I spoke with someone knowledgeable in special ed who said, well, actually, with her code, inclusion code, there's only 3 middle schools in the entire system that have an inclusion strand at the moment. Only 3, not the list of 8 that John Beer gives us of people who are part of the inclusion. It just seems like the system is, you know, between John's vision and where he wants it to be and where it's actually being implemented is like still 2 years apart or something like that in terms of the actual practice.
Well, I think that we need to acknowledge that sort of dealing with the fact that almost half the students have been in substantially separate settings, and that's been sort of the history for a while, that it's not something that's going to be changed quickly, because we don't want to create inclusion programs that aren't meaningful inclusion programs. And I know that the ones that came on last year offer specific things. I can't say exactly, I don't know off the top of my head how many of those are middle schools, and they don't all serve all children. Some of them serve children with specific types of disabilities. We have that list, but obviously it's an issue that we need to do a lot more work on and expand it a lot more heavily and in much more substantive ways.
Well, and let me ask you, going back to the last item on the checklist here, is placement.
Yep.
The only thing that comes out of the IEP meeting is, do they go to an inclusion placement, a partial inclusion, or substantially separate? There's nothing really there about anything else about what kind of school you want. In other words, and just to take another example, one of the flyers out tonight on the table is about these improving school choice meetings that are happening, right? There's the mayor, the whole district is on, BPS is on this whole kick about improving school choice and school assignment. Well, there's no school choice for special ed kids.
Well,
what there is you can refuse a placement, but you have no input other than the IEP meeting saying it's going to be an inclusionary setting, or it's going to be partial inclusion, or it's going to be substantially separate.
you actually have more say than that legally. You have say on not only the type of placement, but the location of that placement.
But
And if the district
it's not on the
offers you,
form anywhere, and I went to a whole IEP meeting. We spent half the meeting talking about placement, and that information went absolutely nowhere after that meeting.
well, and the issue is also that you have the right to observe any proposed program by the district. So you can say, I understand that that's what you're proposing. I want an opportunity to go and look at that program, or to go and have my expert look at that program, and then we'll reconvene to talk about the placement decision, since I am a parent and I'm a member of the team, and I participate in any placement decision.
What they told me was, you can reject your placement, you can submit a transfer proposal, and they'll address it in July.
Yeah, that doesn't sound right, so I think you should make out an issue form, because now we're getting into...
The other thing is that if we are going towards a system where all the schools become inclusion schools, then we will be in a situation at some point where, just like the regular ed kids have a lottery for regular ed seats in schools, the special ed kids, essentially, who could go to any of the inclusion schools, will have to have a lottery for the special ed seats, or in terms of what school they want to choose their
No,
kid to go to.
you can't do that, because the law requires that it's a decision made by the child's team. So you can't have a lottery. I will tell you that I'm on the assignment committee, the external advisory committee, and I was asked to be on it to try to, to make sure that people that are making these decisions understood that we go through a different process as special education, that we go through a placement process, and that any assignment process, any assignment process itself, we want that process to be recognize, to understand, and to reflect that seats also need to be available to children with disabilities.
But are you just saying, when you say the team, are you saying the IEP team
Yes,
should discuss the specific placement of the student in
Yes.
terms of which school
Yes.
they should go to?
yes.
And how is that, I mean, but the people and the IEP team don't know, because everything's in flux, they don't even know what's out there.
I'm just telling you the way the process is supposed
It's
to work.
supposed to work,
Obviously,
I
you're saying
understand.
that you ran into a situation, and probably others have too, that it's not working that way. So that's obviously something that we're working to address. But the
Yeah.
issue is that moving forward, instead of one placement being offered, which was something that had been, happening for a period of time, a long period of time, though we were trying to, John's office was trying to offer more than one placement, but obviously that's a little bit complicated in that there's more than one IEP meeting going on at a time in the city. So someone needs to be tracking where the seats are available and where the seats are not available, and then if parents need to observe, then they need to accommodate that. So I agree, there's a lot of things to be worked out, but they're being worked on, they are. It's just a matter of, getting them working more smoothly and getting them working in a broader way.
But just to read you, this is the form letter I got from Enrollment Planning and Support, not from Special Ed, but basically it says, the Special Ed Department will work closely with the schools to select an education program that meets the student learning needs and fulfills the requirements of your child's IEP. The Special Ed Department will determine a school assignment for your child and notify you of that assignment. You do not need to complete an application. That language suggests the parent has no input into where this child is going.
That letter is 100% incorrect when it comes to the law,
Well,
and the person that wrote that shouldn't have sent that letter out because it's completely inaccurate. That's all I can say.
It's a case of the left hand of the school
That's why we have
department
these
not knowing
trainings
what the
though,
right
so
hand is
that when
doing.
someone's telling you something, you can say, that's not the law, that's not the way it works. Let me help you understand what you need to understand so that my child can get what my child needs. And we'll continue to work on the bigger policy issues. And believe me, I know that we have a lot of work to do, but coming together and being a united voice is how we're gonna get that done. So,
Oh,
I
I'm not-
apologize you got that letter, but it's wrong.
Right,
you
and
know?
I hope you don't take anything I'm saying
No.
as criticism of you, because I'm not, that's
Oh,
not
no,
what
I'm a
I'm saying at all.
volunteer. You can criticize me
Yeah.
all you want, but,
I'm sharing my experience
Yeah.
with the bureaucracy as I've experienced.
Hi, I just wanted to add that when my son does attend the Mason, he's been there since the second grade, and it's been a real excellent experience, except for this year. But for the most part, when I had a complaint, I said, inclusion doesn't mean in the classroom and feeling excluded. But they jumped on it right away, and it's small and it's great. I received the same letter. My son was assigned to a school, I definitely said no, no, no. So just as a parent, I wrote, I rejected, this is why, and, I told him, I said, I got my gloves on, I'm ready. And that, for now, anyway, and tell them why, this is why I don't want my child to go, and this is why I believe this would be the best way. They might not listen, but for right now, that's how he went into the Mason, that's how he got into the early educational center in East Boston, because, I showed them, no, this is not what I want, and I've been pretty blessed with getting a real good team, not telling me what they think is best, but listening and saying, okay, all right, we see it.
but I think it's important that letters like that are brought to our attention so that we can address them with the administration and say, not only is this information completely inaccurate, but it's inappropriate for you to be sending these out for parents, but rather than deal with it on a letter-by-letter basis, it's sort of find out about it from parents and bring it to the administration to say, who's sending these letters out? These should never be going out, and they're completely wrong. And giving people inaccurate information is not helpful or productive. So, but coming to trainings, you can say, that's not, if I got a letter like that, I'd just throw it in the trash because I'd know that none of it was true. It's sort of like junk mail.
It's true only in the sense that other people think that.
But those are not the people that are making the decisions for your child.
Oh, but they already have.
The assignment department?
No, the next form letter which was based, again, was from the assignment unit,
Right.
Office of Enrollment Services.
Well, we as special education,
But they said that the
families
placement
do
came
not
from
go through
special
the
ed.
assignment process.
Huh?
We don't go through the regular assignment process, so we'll have to do a better job educating them on the process for children with special needs. That's all I can say on that, So, completion of the IEP meeting, let's move on. This is just to tell you that within 3 to 5 days, that was the current practice previously. DOE did a memo saying that as long as you get a team summary sheet and you agree, you don't have to agree, you can ask for your IEP to be issued immediately. But I would also say to you, you could push that card, but you're probably gonna get an IEP that's full of mistakes, so you might wanna give them the time to get the IEP done, which is the 2 weeks. But you don't wanna leave your meeting until you have a summary sheet that says what was agreed to. What are the services that we just agreed to? And you want it from the district, not just in your own notes, because then you can go back and compare it to the IEP. So I think that's important, and I always tell families, don't leave your IEP meeting without your team summary sheet. Again, there's a much longer memo on this from DESE, so we're gonna put it on the website so that people can see the whole thing. But I think it's important for you to know that it's within 2 weeks of having your team meeting that they're supposed to get you that IEP. So you don't wanna be waiting, a month or 2 months. You're supposed to have that IEP by then. And then when you get it, you have an affirmative obligation to respond to that IEP within 30 calendar days. So you can accept it in full, you can accept it in part, reject it in part. You can request a meeting to discuss the parts that you rejected. You can reject the IEP in part because it does not include things that you asked for. And you can reject the IEP in part because the district is trying to change something that you disagree with. So just a basic example of that is, my daughter, she has physical therapy 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And I go to my IEP meeting and they say, we're gonna propose that this IEP she have physical therapy 1 times 30 minutes. And I say, no, I don't agree with that. I'm not willing to change it, regardless of what the reasons are. And then I say I reject your proposal to change the physical therapy services, and I'm invoking my stay-put rights to her previous level of services. You can just say you reject it and you're keeping the same. You don't have to get all the exact lingo. And it means that they can't change what was agreed upon unless you agree, or they want to take you to a hearing to get those services changed. It's one of the most important rights I think that we have under special education is the stay put, meaning you can't change what we agreed to unless I agree, or unless you want to take it to another level. And that also goes for placement. The type of placement that your child has. If your child's in inclusion and the district says they want to put them in sub-separate or vice versa, and you say, no, I don't agree with that, you can reject the proposed placement. And you can reject the type of placement or the location of the placement. So maybe you agree with the type, but you went and observed the program and you didn't like the school, then you reject that. So, and just remember to respond to the IEP, whether you accept it or reject it, because that's an issue of, you don't want your child's record to be full of holes in terms of unanswered documentation. And then the next slide is just a list of resources for parents. So the first one I put at the top is the Office of Family and Student Engagement. And I gave you their phone number because they said they do have someone on staff there that answers questions for parents of children with disabilities. The next one is the Federation for Children with Special Needs. And the next one is the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And if you have services in your IEP, and for whatever reason you're not getting those services, there's a department, it's called Program and Quality Assurance. You can call and file a complaint. And if it's a compliance issue where they're not providing something that was agreed to, it doesn't cost you any money. The state will investigate it on your behalf, and they'll issue a finding. They might ask you for some documentation about the issue, probably a copy of the IEP, and then they'll send a request to the district to answer that complaint. And then the next one, sorry that emails, for some reason the emails are very light because of the copying, but they were on there, probably in a different color, but Rights Law, if you just Google that, that's a very helpful parent website. There's a lot of different articles on there on different disabilities, on the IEP process. Again, it's another free resource. And the last page that I included has to do with the contact information within this new structure of BPS and sort of who it is that you want to call, depending on what the specific need is. So I provided the people's names, their phone numbers, and then their direct email within BPS, so that you can just sort of hold on to that. As you can see, it's separated into John Deere's at the top, and then it goes elementary, whether or not your child's on the spectrum, K-8 middle schools, high schools, And then I included specifically early childhood and related services, and that has to do with any of your therapies, OT, PT, speech, those types of services. That's the person that's in charge there. And then behavioral health services for children with emotional disabilities, there's someone in charge there. But it's always nice to know if you have an issue in those areas, who is the person in BPS that I can call to talk about those issues. So, and that's it. Thank you.
Well,